All right. Well, then that being the case, we are still talking about the procurement process, and we had left off when we were last together talking about item categories. And the idea here is other than what we think of as the normal way of purchasing things, which is technically referred to with the item category of standard. There are other ways that, in fact, we can purchase things. And just as an aside here, I guess, to show you how this actually works in the system, let me log into the system here and show you this because it's something that you don't get the opportunity to do in your labs, but is something that you have actually kind of worked in conjunction with in your labs without actually selecting that particular option. So just so that you can see how this is implemented. And I'll just use the transaction code ME21N allows us to create a new purchase order here. And notice with this would be if we wanted to manually create a purchase order without there necessarily being a preliminary purchase requisition. We could supply a purchase order number, we can put in a vendor and things of that sort. But notice here in the line items, there's a place for the material and the quantity and things like that. But then there's this column, and I've got to find the right one here. I think it's this column I, that allows us to select the kind of purchasing that we are doing here. And notice that the default, which is if we leave that blank, then that means we're just following the standard process. But notice there are other options here: consignment, subcontracting, third party, the things that we are in the process of talking through now. So that's where that would show up on a line item basis on purchase orders that we might create. And so we talked about standard and consignment. We talked about subcontracting and third party. What I don't think we talked about is stock transfer, which is kind of different in terms of what we think of when we think about purchasing, in that this is a transfer within a single company code just to move items from one plant to another. So in this situation, we are engaging in material acquisition, but we're not doing so through the use of an external vendor. And so in this situation, there's no invoice, and in fact, there's no payment, at least as far as us cutting a check or doing any kind of transfer of funds. What you're just going to see here is an accounting transaction to show this, but in fact, there's not going to be a financial impact because financial accounting is done at the company code level. We're staying inside of a company code, so our asset values do not change as a result of this, but counts will vary from one storage location and plant to another, and so that is accounted for in the logistics of the stock transfer. And then the last thing that we can purchase is services. So the idea here might be that we contract with someone to come in and paint our building, clean our facility, or do some work on our behalf. And so in this situation, there's no goods. So if there are no physical goods, then there would be no goods receipt. So what do we have to memorialize that the work has been completed if we don't have goods receipt? You know, in the traditional and the other methods of purchasing here, we have a goods receipt that triggers us to validate that payment should be made. Well, with services, we have something called the service sheet that gets completed that says, okay, the service has been completed, and it kind of serves as a proxy for goods receipt in our process. So one of the things that you should be able to do in an exam in the future is not only explain the logistics of each of these different item categories, but also be prepared to answer questions like which of the item categories does not involve our receiving an invoice, which of the item categories does not involve us receiving goods. And in some case, there may be more than one. that would apply to a particular described scenario. So that's brought out in the text here, so make sure that not only can you keep track of the basic idea behind each of the item categories, but that you can also pick up process differences as it exists between them. Any questions about any of those things? All right, so the next concept that we are getting ready to talk briefly about here is one that is very important to us in the context of financial accounting related to materials. And that is the distinction between what are called and considered to be stock materials versus items that are considered to be consumables or consumable materials. Let's talk about the first of these being stock materials. A stock material is something that we buy. Typically, it's something that we buy for resale, but it doesn't have to fall into that category. But the key facet or the key characteristic of a stock material is we are going to inventory this item and we are going to value it in our financial accounting records as an asset. So this might be we're a manufacturer of automobiles and we buy braking assemblies from a manufacturer and we put that in our warehouse for storage. We're going to use it to manufacture something. Well, we are going to put that in inventory. We're going to value it as an asset on our balance sheet. That's different than our buying a case of rags that are going to be used by the workers on the line to wipe their hands periodically and keep their workstations clean, okay? So stock materials are those things that we buy typically for resale or for use as a component in a manufactured item that's going to be resold, but we decide that we're going to place this in inventory and value it as an asset. Now, all stock materials have to have a material master. Anything that we are going to value as an asset has a material master associated with this. And this would include things that we just have one of, such as an asset like a truck or a piece of manufacturing equipment. But any material that we are going to value as an asset will have a material master record associated with it. Now, just to bring together something that we should already know at this point, that material master is going to have recorded in it a valuation class. And remember, the idea here behind a valuation class is we can group together categories of assets. We can say these are goods used to manufacture cars, and these are, we can create our own different valuation classes. We map those to asset accounts in our general ledger, and then we assign individual materials to that valuation class on their material master. And this is critical in our financial accounting processes because that is, and we observed this before, this is the connection between materials management and financial accounting. The valuation class maps the material to an account where the material value is reflected. So these last 2 points are not new to us, but they're very, very important in the context of this point here. And we know this. This is an example of automatic account determination. So anything that we buy that we're going to value as an asset has a material master record. That material master record has recorded on it a valuation class, and that valuation class maps the value of that asset ultimately to an account in our general ledger where the value of that asset will be maintained. So everything that we have talked about here so far, everything that we have talked about in these last points here is focused on money. The whole idea behind the valuation class is it gives us a place to reflect the dollar value of the item. The posting that's made to the general ledger accordingly is a dollar-related posting, of course. Account determination is focused on the dollar or other currency-based value of something. But there's one other. Yes, sir. Roger? Yes. Yes. Absolutely, they would be. So for stock materials, we concern ourselves with actually two different things. We concern ourselves with the money, the value of something, and we concern ourselves with the inventory count. Now, the inventory count is not kept in the general ledger. The general ledger is just focused on money. So the general ledger might tell us that we have $10,000 worth of bicycle helmets in stock. But it doesn't tell us where they are, and it doesn't tell us how many bicycle helmets that is. It could be one really, really expensive bicycle helmet, or 10,000 really, really cheap ones, or a mixture. We just don't know. So the inventory count is tracked separately. An inventory count is actually tracked at 3 different levels, and your last lab exercise, the one that you're getting ready to turn in, actually shows you this in one of the screenshots that you have to take. We can look at inventory count on a company code level, we can look at inventory count on a plant level, and we can look at inventory count on a storage location level. So the idea might be, we have as a company code right now 5,000 bicycle helmets. Of those, 1,000 of them is in plant 1, 3,000 of them is in plant 2, and the remaining 1,000 is in plant 3. And then when we look in plant 1, 500 of them are in this storage location, and 300 of them are in this storage location, and so on. So inventory count is tracked separately from inventory valuation. And inventory count is tracked at the levels that you see here. Inventory valuation is tracked at what level? Company code level, financial accounting, okay? So we keep track of the money side of this at the company code level. But we need more detail than that when we're talking count. It does us no good to say our company owns this many of something. We've got to know exactly where it is. So for stock material, the system is actually keeping track of 2 different things. It's going to keep track of an inventory count, and by the way, we can get at that number on the material master, as well as other specialized transactions. Once again, you're going to see that, if you have not already, when you complete phase 6. And then inventory valuation, we can see in looking at balances on general ledger accounts or on other transactions as well. So anything that we value as an asset, we're going to keep track of all of this information in the manner that I have described here. That is distinct from a consumable material. Now, a consumable material is something that we buy to use. It could be grease for maintaining our equipment. It could be rags to use in the shop. It could be, a mop bucket to be used by our janitors. These are things that we have to buy because we need them, but we're not going to value them as an asset. There's a big difference in a truck and a mop bucket, okay? We want to keep track of the truck because it's going to cost us a lot of money. I have no idea what a mop bucket costs, but you would have a very, very demoralizing job if one day your boss came to you and said, go through the factory and inventory all our mop buckets and make sure you can track them down. Nobody cares about that. Whereas if a truck goes missing, that's going to kind of be noticed here, okay? So a consumable material is stuff that we buy because we have to buy it, but it's not an asset. We're buying it to use. Yes, sir.
Something like that would normally be a consumable. Is it possible that it might change over to a valuation just due to maybe a loss or an excessive use of such a product, where the company decides that actually we do want to track this valuation because we're going through so much of it?
We'll cover how we track this. I still don't know that we would value it. Imagine, for example, a box of rags. we're not going to value them as an asset, but we don't want to be buying a box every other day because employees are taking them home with them. So we might still lock them in a closet and keep count of them, but we're not going to show that on our balance sheet, $7.50 worth of shop rags. So it has really more to do with value. Now, to get to the other question, there are some times where the line here becomes really, really fuzzy because, maybe we're a company that makes shop rags. And so because we make shop rags, we have a whole warehouse full of shop rags. We're going to value those as assets because that's our inventory that we sell. But ironically enough, periodically, we may pull some of them out to give to our cleaning people to wipe stuff up with. And at that point, those are considered consumable materials. So you really have to think about the business and their processes to decide which is which. And for that reason, it's really hard to universally say, well, you never value a shop rag as an asset. Well, you do if you're a shop rag company, okay? So you always have to take those things into account. Now, what's interesting about consumable materials is if we want to make a material master for it, we can. The system will let us create a material master for consumable materials. But if we don't want to, we don't have to. See, the primary reason we have material masters is to help us keep track of things from a valuation perspective, to establish the mapping we were just talking about between that item and our general ledger. We're not going to be valuing these as assets. It's really not worth it. If imagine, for example, we run a medium-sized business and one day we run out of shop rags and we go to Sam's Club and buy a case, and before we can start using them in our company, we say, no, somebody's got to create a material master for these shop rags. It's just not going to do that, okay? So there are things that we can actually buy that we don't have a material master for. If we do have a material master for an item, maybe it's something we buy with great frequency, and so we have a material master for it. That's fine. Even if we do, though, if it's a consumable material, we are not valuing this as an asset. So there is not going to be the assignment of a valuation class. That is going to be left off of this particular material master. So we are not going to be tracking the dollar value of this. But we are going to be tracking inventory count. See, that's the thing. If I want to keep track of how many rags I have or how much of whatever I have, I can create a material master and use that material master to help me keep track of count. But I don't have to, but if I want to create the material master, the system will use it for enabling me to keep track of inventory count, but there's no FI value. Say there's no FI value if we think about the purchase of something. If we buy an asset, normally we're increasing the value of an asset. So what happens when we buy a consumable material? We part with cash if it's a cash transaction, but what's the offsetting accounting entry here? Well, the other aspect of this is these are going to be associated with an account assignment object. So the other half of our double entry accounting transaction here is the cost of the purchase is going to be assigned to an account assignment object, which could be a cost center. So for example, we do equipment repair. People bring us their equipment and we fix it. This could be like an auto dealership or any number of other places where we have technicians who work for us and they repair stuff. Well, we're going to be buying parts that are going to be valued as assets, things like belts and hoses and, let's say, transmissions and various assemblies. Those get tracked as assets. But we're also going to periodically buy, cases of cans of WD-40, the shop rags that we've been talking about, maybe some stuff for for the people to use to kind of keep their hands clean, some kind of cleaning gel or whatever. So when we buy that, we are going to record it as a cost in the context of a cost center. And so perhaps our equipment repair facility has a cost center associated with it called Equipment Repair Cost Center. Well, that's what we're going to assign this particular purchase to. We could be doing, let's say, a manufacturing project, and we assign the purchase of particular supplies, which fall into the category of consumable materials, to that particular production job. And so we see that part of the accounting for conducting a particular job shows not only consumption of assets, but consumable materials being used. We have to set this on a purchase by purchase basis. So we're going to go out and we're going to buy shop rags, and we're going to say, oh, these are for the guys that work in manufacturing assembly. So we assign it to that cost center. A week later, we buy more shop rags, and they're for use by the janitorial staff. So we assign it to the janitorial cost center. So every time we buy these things, we're going to have to associate it with an account assignment object. And what you're going to see here is we can assign this to a cost center, we can assign this to a project, we can assign it to a production order, we could actually assign it to a sales order. Maybe in putting together this order for this customer, we have to pack it in a box with packing peanuts. We don't inventory packing peanuts. We don't count those as assets. We just periodically go out and buy packing peanuts and associate them with sales that we make here. So every time we have a purchasing document for non-valuated materials, for consumables, we're going to see an account assignment take place there. For the sake of time, I'm not going to show you this in the system, but we do this actually on the purchasing document on a line item basis. Questions about any of this? Yes, sir. You could. I don't know how commonplace it is, but it could be done. You can. There are transactions, and we're kind of getting ready to talk about this, that do allow us to change the way something is classified. I'd be hesitant to say, I'm trying to think of something that might walk the line between being valuated and not valuated. Let's say we were a cell phone company and we made like a really, really cheap cell phone. We might periodically go in and take a case of those and just give them to our employee. I don't know. I'm having a hard time coming up with a feasible scenario here. But we can move things. Now, keep in mind that we have to take into account whether or not we have a material master for something. We might have to create one where it doesn't exist if we're going to truly value it as an asset. Other questions?
You don't want to switch it over if you have destruction, like if for whatever reason you're keeping consumable materials in a separate location that you burn, like for insurance policies if you wanted to.
I think we could still do an insurance claim without claiming them as assets. Yeah, I mean, because keep in mind, we're gonna keep track of count if we have a material master. If we don't have a material master, it's going to be a little bit harder. I'm kind of reminded of in Florida when we had a hurricane one time and the contents of our refrigerator were destroyed. Spoiled. That makes it sound less dramatic, I guess. And so we did an insurance claim. And, I'd never done an insurance claim for something like that. So I kind of went over the top where I got up my cell phone and my wife and I, as we were throwing everything out, we took a picture of every item before we threw it away. And then I created a spreadsheet And then I went to the store and wrote down the cost of everything, and I sent that to my insurance guy, and I think he probably laughed for weeks. He probably still shows it to people because he just says, we just give people a flat amount for what's in their refrigerator. And it was a higher amount than my itemization. And he's like, so I'm just going to pretend you never gave this to me, and I'm going to file for this much. And I was like, but I have hours in that. But, so yeah, I don't think the insurance company's going to come in and say, now, how many rags did you have? They're just going to ballpark stuff like that because of the, it's just fairly minor in scope. These are good questions, though. Other questions? All right, so stock status. What is this? Well, every item that we have in our possession has a status associated with it, which kind of describes its state. In other words, I see it sitting there, so clearly we have it, but can I use it? Or does somebody else have it reserved? Are we getting ready to send it back to its supplier because it's defective in some way? Stock status allows me to keep track of that. Some examples of stock status, but this is not an exhaustive list, would be an item is unrestricted use. Unrestricted use means that pretty much just what it says. If you want it to sell to a customer, or if you need it for use in the manufacturing process, have at it. It's available for use, there's no restrictions. Many times companies will buy things, and before they put them in inventory, they will engage in inspection of those things. So we might have something that came in today, but we're not ready to let people start using it until it's in quality inspection, until it's passed inspection. So we assign it the stock status of quality inspection. And then the inspectors are going to come in, they're going to look at the items, and if they're satisfied with them, they're going to say, yeah, these are good enough, put them in unrestricted use so that people can use them. Blocked stock is kind of what we do with things that don't pass quality inspection. These are things that we have in our possession, but we don't want to use. They're damaged, they're unusable. Maybe we got the wrong delivery from the supplier, and so we possess them. They're sitting in our storage room in a particular location, but nobody should use that stuff. It's blocked stock. We also have stock status for things like stock in transit. One of the variants on unrestricted use is for us to have items that are reserved. And the idea there, if you think back to your ERP SIM experience, if we ran the MRP process and we have sent a production order to our factory, but the factory's queued it up for work next week, so they know they're going to need that set of materials, but it's still sitting in our storeroom now, those are reserved. Because what you don't want to have happen is you don't want the factory to be ready to go, and then we go in and we look for the materials and somebody else has taken them. So we can put things in a reserve status to protect them. So stock status allows us to track the availability of materials. And you'll see this in the Material Master on the plant stock view. And let's do that. Let's go into the system real quick. I don't think we have gone into it yet today. So let's look at this real quick. So 308. Oops. Oh, thank you. I don't know where I got 308 from. I think I must be logged on at my office. Or maybe I was logged on here already. Okay, so logistics, materials management, material master, material, display, current. And now I have to try and think of a material that I'm likely going to have in stock. Knee pads? Okay. All right, so I'll do knee pads. And then the question becomes, okay, which view? And my slide said here that this is tracked on the plant stock view. So let's look for the plant stock view and make sure we add that to our display. And then I don't know whether, well, I know I don't have it at MI06. Let's see if I have any of that in MI02. A knee pad is probably a trading good. So let me change that to a trading good and see if I've gotten lucky here with my choices. And so we'll go to plant stock view. And yeah, here you can see it right here, that right now I have 45 unrestricted, none in restricted, none in quality inspection, none that are blocked. Here's another stock status returns. Those are things going back to the supplier. I don't have anything in transfer. Notice I can have in transfer and in transfer inside of the plant. So that allows me to differentiate if it's going someplace else or just going someplace in-house. Unrestricted consignment, restricted consignment, consignment and inspection, blocked consignment. So we have these different statuses associated with consignment. Stock in transit, it's in a truck going somewhere. And then you can see other things here as well. So this is what I'm talking about. For every material that when we look at it in terms of plant stock, we can see the stock status, and different transactions and processes will put reservations on materials or otherwise show them. Now, how do I change the stock type? This is one of those really, really important facts right here. Changing the stock type or value of a material. And this goes back to the question I was asked a moment ago. Could we convert it from a consumable to a valuated good, to a stock good? We can do things like that. But those are all going to be things that are done through a goods movement of one sort or another. And so a goods movement, to give you a generic description of it, a goods movement is a transaction that causes a change in stock value or stock status. Now you might look at that and say, I don't really get that. Isn't a goods movement a transaction that causes goods to be moved? Well, yeah, that's true. But what's really more important to us is something started out at plant 10, storage location 1, and now is in plant 11, storage location 3. And so in the process of doing that, maybe it went from unrestricted stock here to stock in transit while it was on board a truck moving from point A to point B. And then when it got here, it became maybe in quality inspection for us to check it over to make sure it didn't get damaged in transit, and then ultimately to unrestricted use. So we know we have the material. We, of course, are tracking it now in this situation to know, where it actually is and what's its availability. While it's in transit, I can't really do anything with it except wait for it to arrive at the next location. When it gets to plant 11, before it passes quality inspection, I can't really do anything with it except wait for it to be inspected. So while it's true that a goods movement typically does mean that the items are moving, of equal note is the fact that it causes the stock status to change in regards to what's actually going on with a particular material. Question about that? Yes, sir.
So, assuming that those two plants were in the same cost center, then we would have no financial documents involved in that movement, since they're under the same cost center?
I don't know that cost center is as big a concern as company code. So yeah, if they're in the same company code, then we don't have an issue here to capture in financial accounting. Okay. Other questions?
So, say we were transferring stock within an enterprise but a separate company code. Does one company have to buy that stock from the other
that is what we're getting ready to talk about on our next slide. So I think that we can answer it there. So, other questions about this though before we head there? Okay, so let's talk about goods movements for a second. Because as has been observed through the questions here, goods movements might have a financial accounting implication. They might not. Goods movements are really, really, really complicated. In your book, Table 4-18 gives you a table of goods movements. There are hundreds of goods movements identified with 3-digit codes. We're just going to talk about a handful of them. A goods receipt is a kind of goods movement. Goods receipt is when we have inbound materials either coming to us from a vendor or coming to us from the production line. And so we now have something we didn't have before. So our stock is increased and our value may be increased. Why does that last sentence say value may be increased instead of value is increased? Where, in what scenario would value not be increased in conjunction with a goods receipt? If it was consumable material, yeah. So stock number, stock count is increased, but the value is only increased if it's a stock material. So we have goods receipt that triggers, hey, we now have something. Goods issue is the outbound side of this. A goods issue means that we're withdrawing material either to consume it or to ship it to our customer or other things of that sort. Now, the reason why I said there are so many numbers is because every time we have a goods movement, we have a goods issue, and you've seen this in your lab work where it's like goods issue to production or goods issue to customer. And those are different material movement numbers. So goods issue is an outbound movement of goods. The material's withdrawn, it's consumed, it's shipped to the customer. So in that situation, the stock is decreased. And of course, although it doesn't say it there, the value may be decreased as well if the item in question was a valuated or stock material. Now, a stock transfer is when we have a lateral movement between storage areas internal to an organization. We talked about this as being an item category in the context of a purchasing organization. So, or excuse me, in the context of a purchase order. So this right here, stock transfer, lateral move between storage areas internal to organization. What do I mean by that? I mean internal to a client. So a stock transfer can span across different company codes. So what I'm actually going to have here is I'm going to have a stock transfer with a movement type of stock transfer to another company code that's going to be kind of like the logistics of purchasing or selling, but we're doing it internal. So the question was raised before, does that mean we have to pay for this? Well, in the grand scheme of things, yes. But we're not going to be cutting checks or other things like that. We're just going to see transactions in our general ledgers between company codes that reflects money moving back and forth. And so we do that. It's not that unusual in an organization for one part of the organization to pay another part of the organization for things like this. So if we're moving stuff around in-house, the stock transfer is the mechanism that we use to do that. Now, a transfer posting is a very interesting kind of goods movement. Because, and this is one of those kind of weird questions that might show up from time to time, true or false, you can have a goods movement even if the goods don't physically move. And the answer is yes, okay? Although a goods movement typically does signal that materials were in one place and they're going someplace else, we can actually have a transfer posting that is a goods movement that just lets us change the stock status. What would be an example of that? I have items that just came in and they're in quality inspection, and the inspector wants to make them available for unrestricted use. The inspector will do a transfer posting and say these materials are now, they were this status, they're now this status. The materials might not have moved. Depends on our logistics of where we put stuff in our organization. But a goods movement does not necessarily mean that the items physically moved. It is also worth noting that the only way you can change the material status of an item is through a transfer posting. So this is the way that we take something and put it into reserve stock, or put it into blocked stock, or otherwise change its status. We do that with a transfer posting. Questions? All right, well, we are just about finished with kind of some of the background elements of the procurement process. I have one more slide here, which is this idea of a material document. A material document is what allows us to track goods movements. So goods movements are tracked on a material document. And let's see if my SAP GUI is still up. Oh, I hate this. It just, on my laptop here, Wi-Fi just seems to eat SAP GUI instances as soon as it goes into the background. So let me log in here again, and let's look at this real quick. Okay, so logistics, material management, go someplace new this time, inventory management, material document, display. Okay, so, and I'm using an obsolete transaction. There's a newer version of this transaction, but I don't know what it is off the top of my head. So I want to look for material documents. I'll just do a search here, and I'll do it for one of my plants. Oh, I don't need to search for that. I'll just type it in. I'm going to do this for plant MI02. And so I'll key that in and execute, and it's now going to show me all of the different material documents associated with my organization here. And so I can go in and I can say, oh, let's look at this guy right here. Notice it's associated with water bottles, and I can pull that back in, and here we have this particular material document talked about water bottles and water bottle cages. Notice here the goods movement type is 561. What is 561? Notice all the goods movement types here. 561 is initial entry of stock balance. So this is when I just magically made water bottles appear in that one transaction for the sake of inventory, and here that is. So anytime I have a goods movement, we can use this transaction. Anytime I have goods movement of any type, I can see that happening in the material documents. Questions about any of this? All right, I'm going to skip over this, and we are now ready to talk about the procurement process in terms of its various steps and execution, and that's how we will round out our discussion on things related to procurement. This is a diagram from your book that we will step through here and talk about that shows us the procurement process. In the upper left there, you see that the procurement process begins with requirements determination. That's the creation typically of a purchase requisition. And you notice the trigger here, this is not an exhaustive set of triggers, but it could be triggered by the fulfillment process, it could be triggered by the production process, it could be triggered by MRP. Lots of different things can trigger requirements determination. Then the next step, do we know where we're getting the stuff from? If we do, we can just go ahead and proceed to vendor selection. If we don't, we're going to have to figure out our source of supply. In doing so, we might have to request price quotes or proposals from vendors and get back quotations from them. When that's done, either way, now we have a vendor that we can select. We create the purchase order, we send that out, we wait for goods receipt, we get the invoice, we verify the invoice, we pay, and we're done. The documents associated with this that we will see, there's a whole host of them here. We have financial accounting documents, cost accounting documents, material documents, and transaction documents. So all of that at the end of the line here. So step one was requirements determination. The trigger from this is we either have requirements from other processes or this is manually determined. Now, in most organizations, particularly those running SAP ERP, it's very likely that this is going to be triggered by the MRP process. We have sales forecasts, we use that to plan our production, and from that comes a set of requirements for raw materials, semi-finished goods, and so on. And so that is going to trigger the creation of a purchase requisition. But it could be manually determined. The idea there is, one example I typically use is we hire a new salesperson. That salesperson needs a new laptop, so they requisition a laptop and therefore have purchasing acquire one for them to use as a part of doing their job. It is very important for us to understand that a purchase requisition is a planning document. So it has no external obligation. We could elect not to proceed with a purchase requisition. The approval process is typically something that is a very important part of the purchase requisition structure here. For example, here at ETSU, there are various limits on what people can purchase without approval from other entities. And I forget what the actual number is because it does change from time to time, but I'm pretty sure that any purchase the university makes in excess of $1 million requires approval from President Noland. But there are things that can be bought apart from President Noland that cost less than $1 million. But if you were to go into our purchasing system and create a purchase requisition for something that would be that expensive, in the workflow, one of the steps would be approval from President Noland. I know that depending upon what kinds of things I purchase here for the department, some things go through different facets of accounting here on campus, depending upon where the money is coming from. And so a given purchase requisition might have to be approved by 3, 4, 5 different parties before it actually can be turned into a purchase order. So the purchase requisition is a planning document that allows us to do things like collect approvals and otherwise make sure that we really are wanting to purchase this as an organization. Now, sometimes we're going to have a requisition for something that doesn't have a material master. Sometimes we will have a requisition for things that have a material master. So realize that in all of your lab experience that you've ever done in this class or in any others where you've used SAP and you've done a requisition, you likely have requisitioned a particular material. You know, you may have put in, and my pen seems to have stopped working here, so I can't write on the screen, but you might have requisitioned material MM142 or some other material number for it to be processed, and that's perfectly valid. But you can also create a purchase requisition where there's no material number and you just free form type a textual description of what you want. I want a laptop with, and you type out the characteristics, and that goes on to the purchase order. So sometimes you will see purchase requisitions that specifically reference a material master, but oftentimes that's not the case. Just depends on what it is that I'm requisitioning. Once again, if I'm requisitioning consumables, I may not have a material master for them, but on the shop floor, someone might turn in a requisition for a case of shop rags, and we're going to buy them, of course. This is a very, very important fact and an opportunity for us to talk about something that you saw referred to in your lab work very early in the semester. A purchase requisition has no FI or CO impact. And the reason for that is it's a planning document, okay? We haven't actually spent any money. So there's no financial accounting implication here, no cost accounting implication. Now you might say, let's say you were someone that worked for an organization and your responsibility was cash flow management. You might say, I want to know what purchase requisitions are in the pipeline so I have an idea of about how much money we'll be spending over the next month. Well, if we don't track FI or CO implications of purchase requisitions, you don't know how much you are spending until you actually commit to it, until you actually issue the purchase order. But you might say, well, I'd really like to know what we are looking at spending, even though we haven't formalized it. That's commitment management. If an organization turns on commitment management, then various people in the organization can go in and see the dollar value associated with purchase requisitions that are in the pipeline, so that they get a sense of what our future cash flows might be like. This is totally optional, but it's a facet that many companies will employ, and the term for this is commitment management. If I want to, get a better handle on things that I'm about to commit to, I turn on commitment management to give me a little bit finer grained planning process here. The purchase requisition process does not generate any material documents because there's no goods receipt. Nothing has actually happened here. I'm just planning to make a particular purchase. Any questions about this? So if we look at what's on a purchase requisition, there are some things that clearly have to be here. For example, maybe we'll see reference to a material master if a material master is coming into play. We definitely are going to see things like dates and quantities and where we want things to be delivered, but some of these things are optional. For example, if I don't know who I'm going to be buying it from, we may not see reference to a vendor. On the other hand, in my company, we may know that we buy all of our computer equipment from Dell, so the purchase requisition just reflects buy this from Dell. We're going to have to obviously have reference here to company codes and receiving plants and things of that sort, but a lot of what you're seeing on this slide may be optional in some implementations of the purchase requisition process. So if we go back to our diagram here, we've talked about this now. Requirements determination, we have a purchase requisition. So when this gets sent to purchasing, they have one immediate question, which is, do we know who we are sending this purchase order to? And there are two different scenarios here illustrated by this diagram at the top. We might already know who's getting this purchase order. So we go directly from purchase requisition to purchase order. That's pathway 1. Pathway 2 is we don't know who we're getting it from, so we engage in the request for quotation process. We get a quotation, and then we act on that quotation which is pathway 2. Now you might say, well, what's that pathway 3? That looks really, really weird, and admittedly it is kind of bizarre. Pathway 3 says we get a purchase requisition, we request quotations, and then before the quotations show up, we go ahead and order it. And we can do that sometimes. You know, you might say, why did you bother asking for quotations if you weren't going to wait for them to come in? Well, maybe situational factors. Maybe it took too long for people to get back to us with quotations, so we just went ahead and ordered from our default supplier without finding out what prices other people would order or would offer for this. So the focus of this is what we call source determination. In order to convert a purchase requisition to a purchase order, we have to know the supplier. Why? Well, it's just kind of logical. You can't send an order to an unknown company. So one of the things that distinguishes a purchase requisition from a purchase order is a purchase requisition may make no reference at all to a vendor, but a purchase order has to. So how do we determine suppliers? For many organizations, they maintain a source list, which is a set of companies that are validated vendors for us to purchase from. Here at the university, if we are buying computer equipment, the default supplier of that computer equipment is Dell. If we don't want to buy from Dell, we have to have a really good reason. But if we want to buy from Dell, we don't have to have a reason. That's our default purchaser. And so source determination is where we align our needs with the supplier that's actually going to fulfill them. We may, in fact, have existing agreements with some of our suppliers. This is an outline purchase agreement. And so in that situation, the source and pricing might be established already. Back when Aramark was the campus vendor for food, anytime someone on this campus, with the possible exception of student groups, I'm not sure about that, but anytime someone was buying more than $500 worth of food, you absolutely had to buy it from Aramark. If you were buying less than $500, you could, order from Chick-fil-A or Firehouse or wherever. You had liberty there. But anytime you were buying more than $500, you had to buy it from Aramark, which meant that if someone tried to create a purchase order to Chick-fil-A on Market Street for $525, it would be blocked by the system. You can't do that. And that's because the university's contract with Aramark specified that. And that was part of our agreement. The nice thing about Sodexo is there's no such agreement anymore. Sodexo has said you can buy from whoever you want to. We hope you'll think about buying from us, but if you want to buy from someone else off campus, you are free to do so. So sometimes we have these purchasing agreements in place, sometimes we don't. And many times, if we do have these agreements in place, our source may be contractually fixed as an organization, and we have to buy from a particular designated supplier. If we do this, many times our contracts specify that we have to buy a particular dollar amount. And so every year we might have to buy at least $1 million or $500,000 or whatever have you. When we find ourselves in that situation, the terminology here is that a particular purchase is called off a given contract or called off a given scheduling agreement. Now what does that mean? And let me put this on the whiteboard here since I'm running out of room on my slide. Maybe, for example, we buy coal from a coal company. And we have a contract with them that says there are 4 quarters in the year. And you must buy at least 250,000 pounds every quarter. 250,000 pounds, and it's the same for all these. Well, in this situation, I submit a purchase order for 100,000 pounds in quarter one. This purchase is being called off against a scheduling agreement, which means I've fulfilled part of my requirement here. It may well be that once I buy beyond this $250,000 or 250,000 pound amount, maybe I get a discount on additional purchases. Or maybe once I fulfill a given contract in a given quarter, I could buy from another coal supplier if I were inclined. It's whatever our contract says here. But in this situation, this would be called a scheduling agreement, because I have a contract that specifies my purchases for a given period of time. Sometimes I don't have a scheduling agreement, I just have a general contract. And that should say contract, not contact on the slide. But the idea here is I might have a contract that just says you buy all your coal from us. And so in that situation, my order is being called off against our contract. So that's just some purchasing terminology that you see here that relates to us demonstrating our fulfillment. Many times, the reason why organizations enter into these is for favorable pricing, and we might be told, you agree to buy 250,000 pounds every quarter from us, and for every pound that you don't buy, I have no idea what a pound of coal costs, but let's just assume for every pound it's $1. We might get to the end of quarter one, and if we didn't spend $250,000 with them, they might say, well, you're 30,000 pounds of coal short, so you have to pay us a quarter for every pound of coal you didn't order. And I'm not getting any coal for that. I'm just going to cut them a check for 30,000 times a quarter. That would be part of, perhaps, of our outline purchasing agreement. So we want the system to keep track of this, and then as we fulfill our obligation by placing these orders, where we're calling off, which is another way of saying we are fulfilling our part of this contract, which is why these are often also called release orders, because I am fulfilling my obligation, and I am cumulatively releasing myself from the obligation that I have made with a particular supplier, presumably in exchange for favorable pricing. Questions about this? We have summarized this in a matter of about 5 or 10 minutes. If you were to work in a purchasing department for an organization, this would be most of what your life would be. Lining up suppliers, searching the market for suppliers, working on arranging sourcing agreements, a lot of actual work here, even though we're not spending a lot of time actually talking about it. So once we know who's getting our order, the next step is to create a purchase order. Now, there's lots of different ways that we could create a purchase order. You could go in and just create a purchase order out of nothing. So we could create it without reference to anything else. Or, to save ourselves time, we could create a purchase order with a reference to a purchase requisition. You've done this in some of your recent lab work. You created a purchase requisition, and then when you were ready to create the purchase order, you put in a supplier and you adopted the purchase requisition, which essentially just copied the quantities and materials off of the purchase requisition onto the purchase order. So we can create a purchase order by just copying things off of purchase requisitions. We could have had, and we didn't really talk about the RFQ and quotation process here. If I don't know who I'm going to buy something from, because I don't know what pricing is being offered, I might ask many different companies to send me a price quote. Therefore, my request for that is called a request for a quotation, or an RFQ, and they respond with a quotation. Now, in the olden days, sometimes this was done by U.S. mail or fax machine and could take a long period of time. These days, you can email a salesperson and get a response in 5 minutes. So this is something that can be much quicker in overall execution. But if I send out a request for a quotation, I get a quotation back, I can say, okay, I'm going to adopt the pricing and the quantities off of a particular quotation. Or I can go back into the system, find an old purchase order, and just basically say, I want this again. And maybe change the quantities, but otherwise, and change the dates, but otherwise leave everything else the same. So there's lots of different ways that purchase orders can be created. A purchase order is a very, very important document. It is now the source document. It is now the governing document in the goods receipt process and in the invoice verification process. A purchase order is also a legal document that represents a legal obligation on my part if I send it to a vendor and the vendor accepts and acts on that. So once again, whereas the purchasing requisition was just for my own internal benefit, the purchase order has much stronger standing in the overall scope of business processes. But now we see this again. There is no FI or CO impact associated with issuing a purchase order. And at this point, particularly if you're an accountant, that might make you a little uncomfortable, because we have just committed our organization to make a purchase that we're going to have to pay for, and it doesn't show up at all in my financial accounting records. You know, you might say, isn't this kind of like a liability because I've obligated myself to pay something for something in the future, and it in no way shows up on any of my record keeping? Well, once again, that's what commitment management is for. If you turn on commitment management, then you can go in and see, okay, here's purchase requisitions in the pipeline that are being evaluated, and then here's purchase orders that have been released along with expected payment dates associated with it. But unless we turn on commitment management, there's no FI or cost accounting impact at all associated with issuing a purchase order. That does not seem logical, but that is in fact the way this is accounted for. There's no material documents generated because no materials have changed hands at this point. I have committed myself to something, but we don't actually see any kind of memorialization of that in documents other than the purchase order itself. I'm not going to spend a long time going through these diagrams here are things that you see in your textbook, and they kind of just reinforce what we've been talking about here, where you could take a requisition or a quotation or a request for quotation, you could copy that information to a purchase order, and you're putting down the material you want to buy, the vendor, the pricing conditions, and so on. All of that is what goes on to the purchase order itself. Similarly, the purchase order has two different sections to it. The header section, we have a number for the purchase order. We have the payment terms. What's the term that we used for payment terms previously? Conditions is not a, conditions would be prices, which are down here. What's the payment terms a reference to? Incoterms, yeah. This is when we're going to see things like FOB whatever referenced here in the purchase order. So notice Incoterms are set for the entire document that I'm sending out. And notice I specify the Incoterms when I send out the purchase order. And the vendor is designated and the currency is designated. And remember, everything in the header governs the entire document. So then the individual line items, this is just really logical. You see material numbers, you see quantities, you see dates, and you see prices. That's what's on the line item for a particular purchase order. Questions about any of this? Okay, let's look at maybe one more thing here which is purchase order communication, okay? So once again, something that we're going to talk about for 2 or 3 minutes, but in a business is critical part of the purchasing process. So we have the procurement process, which generates a purchase order. Well, there are things that the system will do for us. For example, most organizations will have their systems set up to automatically send purchase orders. We might send a purchase order to a given vendor through electronic data interchange, which means that our computer talks to their computer. Alternately, we might have our system set up to fax orders to different vendors. And that happens here on campus. There's certain things that if I order for the department, I put them into our purchasing system, they get approved, and the system automatically faxes the order out to the vendor, and the vendor on their fax machine gets our purchase order. Some vendors want emails. So the system has set up in it, in our partner functions with a given vendor, how the vendor wants to be communicated with. So notice this, we could set up our system to send the purchase order, and then we can even set it up to do things like send reminders or to send expedite requests. So the idea might be this, I order something and I say I want delivery on November 1st. So a purchase order gets sent out for November 1st. I realize I need it faster than that. So I can go back into the system and say, is there any way you could deliver that by 10/25 instead? That does not change the actual purchase order, but it can result in the system generating an expedite request. And if I'm faxing things to my particular supplier, that would result in them receiving a fax saying, can you move up the delivery? It's a request. They don't have to honor it, but it's something that I can request of them. Reminders are interesting too. If I have a given vendor that maybe is not always the most timely, I can periodically have the system send them reminders. Hey, remember next week you're supposed to deliver us whatever. So this is all part of my partner functions that I can configure, and the system will handle this for me automatically. And you know, historically, this was done through U.S. mail. And I'm sure some of it still does happen through U.S. mail, but the bulk of it anymore, I'm sure, travels through media such as emails or even faxes, electronic data interchange, or web services. And in fact, what's going to happen here is typically we're going to send the purchase order, and the vendor is going to acknowledge the purchase order, or they're going to send notice that they rejected the purchase order. Maybe our pricing is incorrect, or they no longer have the material, or for whatever reason they can't fulfill it. They can reject it. So I am either waiting for acknowledgement or rejection in response to my sending the purchase order, and then I'm also waiting for the vendor to send me shipping notice. And this would typically happen if they're maybe mailing me something or sending it through a third party, or even just scheduling for their truck to show up next Tuesday at 11 a.m. at our warehouse. The great thing about this is a lot of it can be automated by the system based on rules that I set up related to my partner functions with a given vendor. Questions? All right, well, this is where we will stop for today. I do feel it's pretty likely that on Wednesday we will be able to finish up our discussion of the purchasing process so that next week we can start into our next big thing.